news every Sunday, and we're hosting this event. And also a welcome to those watching online, either live or the recording. So you found the teas and coffees, just feel free to help yourself, and there's biscuits and things. Then just go through there and walk around to the back of the building. That's fine. So we're very pleased and welcome Dr. Kathy Myers to talk on this very important subject of the proposed assisted dying legislation that was presented to the House of Commons a few weeks ago, and it's going to have its second reading and vote on the 29th of November, although I'm not sure yet the bill has even been produced for the...
No, it hasn't.
Yeah, so... No. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible that it's such an important piece of legislation, which I know is causing concern for the MPs, and yet it's just a few weeks away from the vote and they haven't even seen it yet. This will have a profound impact on the care for the dying. It's a subject on which people have very real concern, strong views, and I'm sure there's a variety of views, even in this room, as to what is right to do. So it's very important that we listen to one another very compassionately. These are really difficult, real-life situations that we're talking about, and just listen to one another with respect. It's really important that we do that. In terms of the structure of the meeting, Kathy's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a time for questions. We're using, so you can either do it the old-fashioned way, we'll have a mic and you can ask a question here, or you can go on to Slido, you can use the QR code, and you can put your questions there. So particularly as you listen to Kathy, you can actually submit questions online, and we can deal with them at the end. Or go on to slido.com and enter that code, and you can do it that way. And obviously, if you're watching online, that's the only way you can get your question. And I'm sure, Kathy, you're not having to rush away, so if people want to chat afterwards, I'm sure you can do that. The whole session's been live streamed and recorded, but the camera's only facing to the speaker. So when you ask a question and you prefer anonymity, then just don't give your name. But your question itself will be heard. At the end of the day, this legislation is going to be decided by our MPs. I know that Hertford's MP, Josh Dean, is very keen to hear your views, so please do write to him. Kathy's going to say more about that later on, and he's actually asked to see a recording of this talk to help him in his decision-making process. Kathy is a Christian, but will primarily be presenting views and arguments that are not exclusively held by Christians, but actually by any religious faith or none. But obviously you can ask questions about the Christian perspective at the end. But these are very sort of general arguments that you're going to hear now. So by way of introduction to Kathy, this is a very important subject. So what gives you the experience to talk on this subject, Kathy? Please tell us about your background and how you came involved in this area.
Okay, I qualified in medicine a long time ago. I'm now retired, but my first training after qualification was in Romford, in Essex, where I did general medicine, and then I moved to the Royal London Hospital to train in haematology, and that was treating lots of young people with very aggressive leukemia and lymphomas. We took from a whole large area of Essex. And really, it was spending 2 years on that ward, realizing that death in hospital for some could be absolutely dreadful. And I realized there must be a better way of doing it. And we were fortunate that a consultant from a local hospice used to visit half a day a week, and I took to tagging along and realized that he got something that my patients needed. So I jumped ship from haematology, took a bit of a chance, went up to Mount Vernon to start training in palliative medicine there, and did a variety of things, but eventually landed in Hertfordshire and spent many years working in Hertfordshire I've worked in 3 of the local hospices, the Peace, Isabel, Garden House. But the biggest chunk of my career, I did palliative medicine for 25 years, was as the consultant in palliative medicine at QE2 and the Lister in East and North Herts. And it was challenging, but I had a great team, and I hope we made a difference. But I've never regretted the change. So that's really my qualification. I've cared for many thousands of people who've been dying during my career.
It was great to hear. It's not definitely not, absolutely not an academic subject. It's a very real.
It's a very real subject,
yeah.
And I've seen lots of things that have informed my view on this, and it's one I feel strongly about. So I'm looking forward to discussing it with you afterwards.
And this legislation is obviously not the first time that something like this has been presented. You've been involved in previous...
I have. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the debate, but I really got involved. I became aware of it in the early 90s when Lord Walton wrote a report following a select committee discussion in the House of Lords. And that really was the gold standard, I think, in terms of analysis of the issue. But there have been a number of attempts to legalise since then that I can mention. But this one is a very important one. Things are very finely balanced, so it's important that people express their views to MPs, who are the people that have the power to let this bill go further or not.
Thanks, Cathy. Can everyone hear? We're using a different mic. Is everyone here clearly? Yeah, good.
I'll try and stand still. So it
well,
right.
Over to you then, Cathy.
Thank you. If we could put the first slide up, that'd be great. I'll just have to wave at Josh for the slides. Okay. I think it's fair to say that death is one of the few experiences that are common to everyone on the planet. And it's something that we all have to face sooner or later. The problem is that death has not always been easy for people down the years, still isn't. It invokes all kinds of strong emotions, fear. It's quite mysterious, we're not quite sure what happens. And so it's not surprising that for a long time, some people have wanted to control the manner and time of their death. As I said, I first became aware of the drive to legalise that control in the early 90s. The next attempt after Lord Walton was the Joffe Bill in 2003, and then moves in the Commons. The most recent before this was 2015, Andrew Marris. And the vote at that stage surprised everyone. It was much more strongly against than people expected. But we've had a 9-year gap now, and we're meeting now because Kim Leadbeater has proposed a bill that will have its second reading on the 29th of November. So time is short. I think it's fair to say that both sides are very well intentioned in this. Nobody's malicious. Compassion, dignity, choice figure strongly on both sides. The point of difference is how we achieve those safely for people that need them. The actual arguments, I think, haven't really changed over the last 30 years since the Walton Report. But two things I think significantly have. The first is that the language has changed, and this is quite important. We no longer talk about euthanasia and mercy killing, or even physician-assisted suicide. It's changed to assisted dying, which is a little bit softer, a little bit more user-friendly, makes it not quite sound quite so threatening. But actually, we're still talking about the same thing as we were 30 years ago. Significantly, the Voluntary Euthanasia Society changed its name some years ago to Dignity in Dying. Again, it just gives it a bit more of a softer, friendlier edge. The other thing that's changed, and this is very important, is that since Walton, a number of countries have legalised assisted dying and euthanasia. I'll distinguish the two in a minute. Netherlands, Belgium, Oregon in 1997 was the first of a few states in America. Canada, New Zealand and parts of Australia now. Now what that gives us is a very significant body of evidence about how assisted dying is working in practice. And so I want to spend a while looking at some of the evidence, because it's from that evidence that we can assess whether it really is truly safe and the impact it's having on society. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to look briefly where the call for change is coming from and the key arguments being made in favour of assisted dying, just to give a bit of context, and then present the arguments against and some of the evidence from other countries to support those arguments. Okay, so if we can move on. What is assisted dying? Now, it's important that we get this right, because when opinion polls happen about assisted dying, it's become clear from independent research that not everybody has the same definition in their heads. Okay? This is a definition I'd like to use. The prescription of lethal medication to enable a patient to end their life at the time and place of their choice. Now, normally, that would involve a doctor prescribing tablets that the patient then swallows. Euthanasia is slightly different. That's where the doctor actually administers the medication. That happens in Canada, and it's usually a lethal injection. But this is what's been talked about by assisted dying. Assisted dying doesn't mean hospice care, okay? It's deliberately ending someone's life using medicines. Now, the Voices for Change who want to see assisted dying, they are often well-intentioned, and they're people who've often had a very bad experience, sometimes many, many years ago, and the memory of an awful experience, death of a parent before there was any kind of decent painkillers or care, can affect people profoundly. Many of the prominent cases over the years have involved people with very tricky neurological conditions like motor neurone disease. It can be very hard cases. The irony is that the bill that's being proposed would not accommodate people with chronic neurological diseases necessarily. So we need to be careful that we don't look exclusively at those cases. And there are two main groups campaigning for a change in the law. The first is Dignity in Dying, and this really the time for the bill has come about because of Esther Ranson and Keir Starmer basically promising Esther that there would be time given to this. Esther has got advanced lung disease and is a strong advocate that she should have the choice to end her own life. And also Prue Leith, whose brother died of bone cancer in 2012. Now, interestingly, her son, Danny Kruger, is an MP, and he is one of the leading voices in the Commons opposing assisted dying. So, different views within the same family. Now, Dignity in Dying is proposing quite a narrow scope for assisted dying with stricter criteria about who can have it. The second group that's campaigning for change in the law, My Death, My Decision, has a much broader approach. The most prominent person involved there is Professor Henry Marsh. You might have come across some of his writing. He's a very prominent neurosurgeon who, again, had to deal with very, very difficult cases. And My Death, My Decision has a much broader scope, saying that really anybody who wants assisted dying should be allowed to have it. But the themes common to both are dignity, choice, compassion. And I don't think any of us would disagree. It's just how you achieve those things. The Dignity in Dying leaflet, where have I put it? Oh, here we are. This came through our door. There have been quite a lot of them around. Here we go. Dignity, choice, compassion. It says inside, dignity in dying is a growing movement of people who demand greater choice and control at the end of life. And I think that word control is quite an important one. We'll come back to it. Okay, so next slide, please. There are several assertions that the proponents of assisted dying make, and I think they probably speak for themselves. The right to exercise autonomy and control over our own deaths. And we'll talk about whether it is actually a right or not. The public want it. And again, opinion polls. I've already said it's very important that we look at what the public are being asked when they vote when they fill in a poll. If you ask different questions of the same people, you get a different answer. I can talk about that in more detail if you want. So polls aren't always reliable. Palliative care doesn't work for everyone. Now, I'd push back at that and say, not everyone has had gold standard palliative care. And what I want to do later on is explain what gold standard palliative care looks like, because not everybody knows what it looks like, and certainly not everybody gets it. And my argument is, if that was provided for everybody, the calls for assisted dying would drop dramatically. Safeguards will be watertight. Well, this is where the evidence from other countries is very important, because I want to talk about some of those and show that actually the safeguards are not watertight at all. And finally, experience in other countries is good. This is very much Prue Leith's line. Well, Oregon's doing it, and everybody seems to be fine about it. Let's look hard at that one. I'd say that experience in other countries is not very good at all once you start digging into the data. So to sum up those arguments, it's really saying we want it, we need it, and we can control it. Okay? So let's move on. I think it's important to iron out 3 misconceptions that have been bandied around in the media and that colour this debate and are quite emotive. Okay. The first one is that people say, I don't want to die in screaming agony. That's a direct quote that I picked up from a newspaper article. We have to have this because dying can be screaming agony. Well, all I can say is I have never seen anybody die in screaming agony. Sometimes people have a period where they are in acute pain, but that's where palliative care services comes in. And again, I'll talk you through how we assess pain so that people don't need to die in screaming agony. That is very, very, very rare. And on the few occasions it happens, there's usually a very specific reason for it. Second one, assisted dying is the only way to guarantee a dignified death. Now that's where dignity in dying is so clever, because the name kind of infers that in order to have dignity, you have to die this way. Again, I'd push back on that, and we'll talk about dignity, and we can also talk about why assisted dying is not always dignified. It's like any medical procedure, any medical treatment, there are side effects. and those related to assisted dying and the medication are not very pleasant. Doctors are doing it anyway. Well, before Harold Shipman, perhaps some doctors were, but things have been tightened up very significantly, and there's very, very little evidence now, I'm not talking about 20, 30, 40 years ago, that doctors are doing it anyway. They'll say, oh, well, the drugs, they just put the painkillers up and put the painkillers up until the patient dies. Well, actually, they don't. That's not how it happens. You don't kill people with the painkillers. If you use the painkillers properly, people relax and they live longer. So a few little misconceptions about what's going on. I have no evidence at all, I've not found any, that doctors are doing it anyway and are using strong painkillers like morphine to kill people. Okay, so let's move on to what is actually being proposed here. Oh, sorry, we've not got a slideshow. That should be a progressive one. I borrowed this slide. The long title of the bill is that it will allow adults who are terminally ill, subject to safeguards and protections, to request and be provided with assistance to end their own lives. And what is being proposed is the Oregon way of giving tablets, not the Canadian way of giving lethal injections. It is being read on the 29th of November. A day has been set aside, but as yet it has not been published, so MPs have had very little time to think about this. Okay, next one. What we're working on so far is a bill that was proposed by Lord Falconer earlier in the year in the House of Lords that it's thought Kim Leadbeater will follow quite closely. And this is what it says. It's quite a narrow law. You have to be over 18, terminally ill, reasonably expected to die within 6 months. You need to make a clear declaration that it's what you want. You need to have mental capacity. Whoops. And you'll be assessed by 2 doctors and a judge. Okay? Right, can we, I think we've kind of, yeah. So I think it's worth looking at those criteria in a little bit more detail. The most challenging one is, how do you define a terminal illness? Well, the criterion in the Faulkner Bill is that it's a condition that is not reversible by treatment. Now, the problem with that is if you are an insulin-dependent diabetic and need that regularly to keep you alive, or you are a kidney patient needing dialysis, you would count under that criterion as terminally ill. There are lots of medical conditions, chronic medical conditions, where medicines keep people alive and the condition is not reversible. Next, on to the one about reasonably expected to die within 6 months. Could we go on to, I think we've missed a few slides here. Yeah, that's it. That's the definition of terminally ill. If we could go on to the next one about prognosis. Prognosis is notoriously difficult to estimate. There is no cut-off that says for any illness you can expect to be dead in 6 months or 12 months. There's been loads of research on this. Doctors are exceptionally bad at predicting. I love this quote. Mark Glaser was a very senior cancer doctor who actually cared for Mo Molam, who you may remember when she had brain cancer. He thought that she would live for a very short time. She lived and worked for a further 8 years. He says, it's a flawed premise because no doctor, however famous, can predict a patient's time of death until it is almost imminent. Now, I would echo that from my experience. You can probably predict within a week or days, but much longer, it's very, very hard to do. You can recall several patients who came to me some as first opinions or second opinions. And what does he say? They're still being cared for 10, 12, 15 or 20 years later. Putting a label on somebody's prognosis is foolhardy because you're almost certainly going to get it wrong. And the classic one I think of, do you remember the guy, Al Megrahi, who was convicted of the Lockerbie bombing? It's a while back now. He had prostate cancer. He was told it was terminal. Lots of doctors, lots of lawyers involved. He was allowed to return to Libya on the grounds that he had 3 months to live. He went on to live for a further 3 years. With all that assessment, they got it spectacularly wrong. So, if there's a very broad definition of terminal illness, and there's a very broad, a very unreliable prediction of prognosis in this law, how is it going to stay within narrow criteria? It seems logical to me that it's just not. And there are other reasons why it's likely to expand, because other people will challenge it. Our law works on the basis that individual cases can be very powerful. It will only take somebody who thinks they've got a year to live to come along and say, well, actually, I'm suffering just as much as that person, and I might have got 3 years to live. I'll suffer more, for longer. It's not fair that they can have it and I can't. We're very susceptible to case law. There are already a group of MPs lining up behind Kim Leadbeater to broaden this law so it's available to many more people. And there are pressure groups for people with individual diagnoses that are saying, we want this, and we don't have to, we want it when we want it. We don't want to have to be limited to 6 months. So already we're on slightly rocky ground. Now I want to talk about the example of Canada, just to show how these laws can evolve over time. What's called the slippery slope. Here we go. In 2014, the medical associations went neutral in Canada, and that's exactly what's happened here over the last few years. Then 2 women with neurological diseases challenged the prohibition on assisted dying and won on the grounds that they had a right to it. So the first bill, Medical Assistance in Dying, was introduced in 2016 for individuals where death was reasonably foreseeable. Then in 2019, a man with cerebral palsy challenged it, as we've just said, on the grounds that it was too restrictive and his suffering was just as great as most people who are allowed MAID. And he won. In 2020, MAID was changed to allow for death, to include people for whom death was not reasonably foreseeable. And there's a proposal that from 2027, it will include people with mental illness as well. So you can see what's happened. Good example of how it's just broadened and broadened and broadened, being challenged, broadens a bit more, challenge again, broadens a bit more. Canada is exceptional in that the rate of increase there, if you put the next slide up, Josh, there you go, is increasing by about 30% year on year. The red bits at the top, you can just see them, are the people where death is not foreseeable. And that group includes quite complex cases. I'll show you one in a minute. If the number of deaths in Canada was scaled up to Britain, Canada it's about 5.5% of deaths. If it was scaled up to the British number of deaths, we'd be having 28,858 deaths a year by assisted dying. That's a lot of deaths. Okay. The complex case, this is one of many. This is a man in his 40s, significant mental health problems, personality disorder, functional decline following a COVID vaccine, told he'd got ME, chronic fatigue. He had MAID, assisted dying, and at the post-mortem there was no evidence of any pathological abnormality. It was purely psychological, mental health issues, assuming that they couldn't find a reason for his ME. But even so, that's not the kind of person that Kim Leadbeater is envisaging, but that's where we may end up. Now, Oregon is a slightly different model, and we can talk about Oregon if there's time. Let's move on to arguments against assisted dying, and this is really a summary. It's not necessary, it's not safe, it's not right, it's not just about the individual, and it's not now. Now is not a good time. Even if you agree with it, now is an absolutely rubbish time to be going for this. Okay, so let's move on. I strongly believe that we can do much better. And that this kind of slogan is that high quality palliative care kills the pain but not the patient. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The other thing that I've seen quite a lot of is that people change their minds when they get good care. I've seen loads of examples of this. The one that really has stuck with me was a young man I looked after at an AIDS hospice in the East End many years ago. He got AIDS before there were proper treatments, and he got brain disease. He'd always said that if he was losing his sight or he was getting dementia, that was it. No more treatment. Tuck me up, leave me to die. He started losing his sight. He started getting the early signs of dementia. We said to him, you know that statement you wrote, tuck me up, leave me alone. Do you still feel that? He said, no. He said, you've cared for me. I've got hope. I feel loved. Every day is a gift. Change his mind with good care. Lots and lots of those. Good care is the true way to confer dignity on people. And I want to talk a little bit about dignity. Can we move on to the next one? Again, this word is bandied about, but people mean different things by it. I think that the dignity in dying emphasis on dignity is that actually it's all about what I am about. My physical abilities, avoiding feeling shame, avoiding feeling humiliated because I'm being sick or whatever. It's also about my autonomy, my control, my self-determination. When actually there is another way of looking at it, that actually dignity is about who you are in relation to other people. You are worth it, says relational dignity, regardless of your physical capabilities. It doesn't matter if you're being sick and incontinent or you're disfigured. You are worth it, and we will show that by caring for you as you are. So that's a different way of looking at dignity. Have you heard of A.N. Wilson, prominent writer, historian, atheist? He recently changed his mind. He was a signed-up member of Dignity in Dying, and he's changed his mind largely because of this issue of dignity. I just want to read you a quotation from a newspaper article he wrote. I recall going to see one of my closest friends just before he was taken to the hospice. He was in hospital and had just been given a bath by a male nurse. He was weeping, and I wept as I heard about this man's, the nurse's, gentleness, how infinitely kind and caring he was. It was much more than a sistered bath. It was a glimpse, said my friend, into a new world of love and kindness, which felt, said the dying man, as if he had for the first time seen into the life of things, seen what really mattered about life. A few days later in the hospice, having seen this new way of looking at life, he said he was ready to let go of life itself. You see what good care can do? It can change people around. It can show them that they are worth it. So let's move on, and we're aware of the time. Dame Cicely Saunders was one of the founders of the hospice movement, And she had a wonderful quotation that really powered her work and the development of palliative care. And I think sums up dignity. You matter because you are. You matter to the end of your life. We will do all that we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die. The great tragedy of many people that are asking for assisted dying is because they feel abandoned. They don't feel there's anybody there to help, to support, to care. And it's that fear, the loss of control, the sense of abandonment that makes them think that actually it'd be better off to be dead. Now, I think palliative care can do an awful lot towards mitigating those things. And I'll talk about it in a minute. Can we move on to the next one? Here we are. Dame Cicely Saunders talked about 4 components of pain. So that pain is a total experience, not just the physical, but the emotional, the social, and the spiritual. Some people prefer to call it the existential. I've only seen 2 deaths where I remember there being huge distress at the end, and both of them turned out to be due to spiritual pain. One was a man who'd had a long-standing violent dispute with his brother for over 20 years. We tried everything to bring the 2 of them together. The brother wouldn't come into the hospice. He stood in the hall cursing his brother. And his brother died with terrible distress because that relationship was unresolved. Another one was a woman at Michael Sobel House, actually, where I trained, who'd been an advocate of assisted dying for many years, and she was very, very angry that she couldn't have it. She turned her face to the wall, wouldn't let anyone care for her. That was so hard for her family. She wouldn't let herself be cared for, and it broke her family's heart. But most deaths are not like that. Most deaths are comfortable, peaceful, because good care addresses all these domains. The problem is most people wanting assisted dying do not get access to this kind of holistic care. Okay? The thing that makes me so sad is when they go for assisted dying, they cannot be assured that they will get a dignified death through that route. The drugs used are very, very powerful. They have very unpleasant side effects. There's well-recorded evidence of people vomiting, having fits, losing consciousness, only to wake up again. There was a case in the Daily Mail reported this week where somebody lasted 5 days before they died. I think the record is nearly 6 from Oregon. So I think people are being missold. They think they're going to get death with dignity. They don't. They get a cocktail of very, very powerful drugs. There's a better way than that. Okay, now what are the challenges for palliative care? Next one, here we go. Oh yeah, on top of that think about total pain, let's just quickly look at why some people ask for assisted dying. And just think how a total pain approach would help. Fear of suffering, loss of autonomy, can't pursue their activities, social problems, fear of being a burden, mental exhaustion, existential suffering, even financial problems, cost of a nursing home. People are having MAID in Canada because they can't afford good housing. It's shocking. A combination of all those things, not all of which are due to screaming agony, physical pain. There are ways to ameliorate all those, and surely we should be investing in those. Can I have the next slide, please, Josh? The challenges for palliative care at the moment is that it is a postcode lottery, depends where you live. Serious underinvestment, and that's getting cut back. Only 5% of people die in hospices. More need that kind of care. Many more need that kind of care. Hospices usually only get about 30% of their funding from the NHS. All the rest comes from volunteers working hard and doing fire walks and selling things in shops and doing sponsored walks. There's a big, big gap between what is needed and what is provided. Inadequate community and social care, this was the bane of my entire career of 25 years in palliative medicine. It still has not been addressed. Social care is still a complete dog's breakfast. And people are referred very late to it. Now, I think this is a reflection on our society. Hospitals, where half the population die, are very, very focused on physical treatments. And doctors come under pressure from within themselves and from families and patients to provide ever more complicated, expensive, and I would say futile treatments as people reach the end of their lives. 30% of what is spent on most people in their lifetime by the NHS is spent in the last year of their life. Okay? Pressure from families and patients. Well, surely there's something else you can try, doctor. He's a fighter. Surely there's something else. Doctors who can't stop. They're humans. They've got their own fears about life and death. Have you heard the expression, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail? They want to use what they've got, even if it might not actually be the most appropriate thing. They want to give it a go. And frankly, not all doctors are good at recognising that somebody is dying. Several of the most distressing things I've seen in my practice have been people who have been obviously dying, to the point of being unconscious, being sent off for tests. I once challenged a junior doctor, why are you taking blood from that lady? She is dying. Oh, well, they said on the ward round they just wanted to check. No, let's stop. She died within hours. Happens a lot. It shouldn't, but it does. Right, next slide. No process or safeguards are ever 100% safe. That's one reason why assisted dying is not safe. Everything has failure rates. That's one of the reasons why capital punishment was abolished. We constantly see cases of child abuse, children being killed because the safeguards are not safe enough. People will slip through the safeguards because they will never be safe enough. Doctors are not good at assessing mental capacity and obtaining consent. Even now, the judiciary are not keen to get involved in this and don't have the time, they say, or the skills to take it on. It will need huge investment, very complex process to ensure that any form of assisted dying is safe, and even then we can't guarantee that it will be safe all the time. On the figures I quoted earlier about how many deaths there'd be in this country, even if there was just 1 in 200 chance of the safeguards not working, that would amount to about 140 people a year would slip through the net. But I actually think the biggest problem is coercion. Not all the people that want assisted dying, or say they want it, are as articulate and confident and as economically secure as the celebrities that are pushing for it. Many of my patients were very, very vulnerable. They wanted to do the best by their family. They didn't want to be any trouble. Not all families are always kind and caring. There is a spectrum. One of my former colleagues has written recently about seeing frank manipulation of vulnerable patients, particularly when money is involved. Elder abuse is common in this country, more than we think. We don't talk about it a lot, particularly financial elder abuse. A consultant geriatrician has written about older people's money is seen as the family's money. So everybody's got a view on how it might be spent. After all, it's their inheritance. And coercion can be very, very subtle and difficult to detect. I've seen it happen. I've seen people being very, very gently edged towards one particular avenue that actually they didn't really want. And it took a lot of time and skill for my nurses, my team, to unpick that and to get the patient's voice heard. So coercion is a very big problem. I think it was Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. His mother, when she was dying, said something like, "Oh, well, I don't want to be a burden to anybody." He said, "Mum, it will be a privilege to care for you. Every day, looking after you is a gift." But not everybody sees it that way. So we have to be aware of coercion. Can you put the next one up, please? This is one of my favourite quotes from Elora Finlay, who's a senior consultant in palliative medicine. "The sense of duty to die is all too easy to create and all too difficult to detect." And a sense of duty to die can come from lots of places. It can come from healthcare staff. You know, "Oh, well, we really need to get you out of this bed." You know, there's all these people wanting care. It can come from society. One of the most upsetting things, I think, in a previous debate was the concept of the noble thing to do. Do the noble thing, Baroness Mary Warnock, 2019. And more recently, worryingly, Matthew Paris, do the noble thing by society. You've had your share, effectively. It's time for you to just shuffle off and let other people have a turn, kind of thing. No. It hasn't passed governments by that assisted dying saves a lot of money. The potential estimated saving in Canada in 2021 because of MAID was $150 million. So again, how's that going to influence policy? Right, we need to move swiftly on. Third reason, I think it would be a very bad thing. It's not actually right. The European Court has tested twice, once quite recently, whether there is actually a right to die, and there is not. If you say there is a right to die, that right would have to be universally applied. And then anybody could ask for it if it's a human right. You can't discriminate between those that are dying and those that aren't. It'll be up for anybody. But it's actually not the right to die, it's a right to be killed. And that puts a big onus on other people. And we have to think about the impact of this on the other people that will be drawn into it. It will undermine the rights of others, the vulnerable, the disabled, but also staff in the health service. Can we just flip to the next one? Do you know Liz Carr from Silent Witness? Have you seen this documentary, Better Off Dead? Really, really powerful. She represents the views of disabled people towards assisted dying very powerfully, and it's well worth watching this documentary if you haven't seen it altogether. It's also quite funny. Part of the soundtrack is Staying Alive by the Bee Gees, which was just inspired. Disabled people, and another one who's very involved is Tanya Gray Thompson, the Paralympian, are very concerned that passing a bill like this one will give the impression that they are worth less than everybody else, and that they will be treated differently, and they will be gradually pushed towards this. So can we just flip back to the previous one? There we go. The other thing that is happening in Canada and elsewhere is that death is being offered as a treatment option. And again, that is really freaking people out. Well, the doctor said I could have palliative care, they could try a little bit more radiotherapy, or I could have MAID. People coming out and saying, hang on, is he for me? Is he against me? Does he think I've not got any hope at all? It's really upsetting people. Do we really want that happening in our outpatient clinics? It is happening in outpatient clinics in countries where this has been legalised. And the final thing is what it would do to conscientious objectors, to people who didn't want this, to other people that got pulled in. It's not just doctors, it's nurses, it's pharmacists, it's carers. Lots of other people have to be involved in this. It's a very complex procedure. Right, swiftly on. Yeah, it's not just about the individual. I think we've covered all this, really. We need to ask, will the vulnerable feel more or less safe in our society if we go for this? Will people trust doctors and other healthcare professionals more or less if we go for this? Will we invest more or less in good care at the end of life? The experience in other countries says no. They're actually quite glad to be saving money. Will people value their own lives more or less? And again, the thing that's interesting to look at is the suicide rate. The initial sell was, well, there'll be fewer suicides because, it'll be all fine. Actually, the Belgian chap who I put a slide up earlier says no. In Belgium, suicide has been normalised. No one makes any fuss now. If you want to kill yourself, well, that's fine. It's massively undermining suicide prevention programmes and the amount of money being put into them. So people do not seem to value their own lives more. It is normalising killing yourself in society. So, to sum up, it's not the right time. Sorry, Wes. Wes Streeting, Health Minister. He's saying it's not the right time for this because the NHS is in such a mess. And I think he's right. It hasn't recovered from COVID. It's still in a pickle. This is not the right time to be putting this onto the health service. He's also quite worried about the Canadian experience and vulnerable people. But even if you want this, why now? Why is it being rushed through? Why is so little time being given to it? Do we have a Prime Minister here who wants to make a mark as someone who's changed society, a bit like David Cameron and gay marriage? This cannot be a vanity project for a Prime Minister. If we go down this route, it has to be absolutely given all the time it needs, and we do not have that now. Okay, so what can you do? I believe the current law is the safeguard. If we depart from that, we will get dreadful problems. It's a much more complex process than many realise. The experience from other countries is not good, and what is being proposed is open to abuse. If we go down that route, there will be no going back. What can you do? Speak to your MP, if you can, or write to them, handwritten letter. If you a personal email, write to the newspapers, get involved in phone-ins. Just tell people, try and raise awareness, because it's the MPs who have the power on this one, and we need to do our best to influence MPs to vote against it on the 29th of November. I'll stop there. Sorry, I've run over a bit, but... tied himself to the chair. Well done, John. Yes. I think you can take that off.
So thank you so much, Kathy. We'll circulate the Josh Dean's email address. It's very easy to find an MP's email address, or even book an appointment at their weekly surgery and have a chat to them about it. But it's very important that you make this a personal email. Don't just follow a template. We've got a couple of questions on the Slido. First question: as a Christian, surely you would prefer that people don't suffer. How do you reconcile your position with your faith?
Okay. I'll tell you a story. About 18 months into my training in palliative medicine, I'd been a Christian about 8 years. I came across a young woman who really got under my skin. It's a bit of an occupational hazard as a doctor. It doesn't happen often, but every now and again, somebody really affects you. This was a young woman. She was about 20. She had a very aggressive cancer. And she'd come in with terrible vomiting because of chemotherapy, and it looked like she was dying. And I saw a picture of what she'd been like a year earlier, and it was incredibly upsetting to see the before and the after. And I got so angry with God. And I thought, hope I don't get tearful, I thought I have to sort this out. I either can't carry on as a Christian because God has allowed this and I'm too angry with him, or I have to sort out how suffering can happen in the world. How theologically does it tie up? You know, how does God allow it? So I set about doing quite a lot of reading and study, and it took me about a year of really grappling with this. And I came across, I think, three big marker points in the Bible that were hugely influential for me. The first was Genesis 3 and the account of how suffering came into the world. That whether you take Genesis literally or not, mankind's disobedience and rebellion against God brought suffering and death into the world. If you remember the story, Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, and the way to the tree of life was cut off. And they were cursed, the land was cursed, everything was spoilt. The next thing was the Gospels and the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, where God intervened in this astonishing way. He suffered himself, he suffered the most appalling death, but he beat death by rising again and working through what that meant. And then the very, very end, Revelation 21, where it talks about wrapping up the whole thing, and that one day there will be a time when there are no more crying, no more mourning, no more death, no more tears, because the old order of things has passed away. Sorry, it always chokes me up. But I have hung on to that throughout my entire career, that it is because of what God has done. He plays a long game. He might not fix it now for that person, but he's onto it. He's a good God. He can use suffering for good. I've seen that a lot in people's lives. And one day it will be wrapped up, and there will be no more death and no more pain and no more tears. Praise God. That's what he's done, you know, in salvation history. And that was what I had to learn at a very deep level in order to carry on in palliative medicine.
Thanks, Kathy, very much. Another question, regardless of faith, if our palliative care was better, do you think we would be having these discussions regarding assisted dying?
I think we'd be having far fewer, because with good quality care, people don't get that desperate. They don't feel so abandoned. And like the man in the A.N. Wilson story, even right at the end of life, people can learn to accept care and see life and love and dignity in a new way. And I've seen that so many times, that people work through hard things and they do essential things that need to be done that can't always be done in hospital. They say, I love you. They say, thank you, sorry, please forgive me, I forgive you. When they're aware of dying in the right environment, and when those things happen, it is very beautiful, and they die at peace and comfortable. So that's what I think the gold standard is. And if we had that, people saw that, they wouldn't be so keen on assisted dying.
Thanks, Kathy. Are there any questions in the room?
Hello, yeah, Neil Smith from Oakwood Chapel in Harlow. This bill, second reading at the end of the month, that's only the next step in the process,
Yes.
parliamentary process.
Yeah.
Can you remind us what happens after then, please?
My understanding is that if MPs vote for it, it will then go to a committee stage and they will take evidence and they will make necessary amendments. Then they will bring it back to the Commons, and if it's voted for again, it will go to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords will get a chance to have a go at it, and again, make recommendations and to vote whether to accept or reject. Now, it's very unusual at that stage for the House of Lords to boot something out. It may also run out of time, but then Keir Starmer has promised time, so we're not sure how that will happen. So even if unless it's voted out definitively on the 29th of November, there may be a number of more stages before it actually becomes law.
Any other questions in the room?
Thanks, Kathy. I suppose it follows on from an earlier one. Is there a real worry that if this goes through, investment in palliative care and the hospice movement will really take a back seat more, or?
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, the latest budget has hit hospices hard because of the changes in national insurance contributions, which affect nursing homes and hospices. It would be wonderful if they were part of the NHS, but they're not. So they will be struggling even harder. Recruitment is difficult. Some are cutting back services and beds. And all that means is that more people end up in hospital, where it's much harder to give them gold standard palliative care. And they don't have provision when they need it. So yeah, there's no sign that there's going to be greater investment in hospices, and that hasn't happened in other places.
If there's, Luke.
I think you touched on this a few times, but I was wondering in terms of advice or encouragement for us in our lives, whether with family, with church family, with those around us, in terms of how we can provide care and do it well, and in terms of our own mindset and thinking and attitude towards others, or even towards ourselves, as you know, someday we'll get to a stage where we are facing death. Any sort of advice or encouragements, particularly for that?
I think it's important that if we find ourselves caring for others, we don't isolate ourselves. I think so many people who are carers get very isolated, and that's not a good place to be. We need to be in contact with other people, and I know churches are great sources of community, and that's wonderful. And we need to be looking out for carers, and we need to have carers able to ask for help and receive it from friends and family. The ones that really suffer and struggle are the ones who are doing it in isolation. And I think the other thing is to take breaks where you can. What keeps many people going as carers, and I think again of children with huge disabilities and needs and what it's like for their parents, they need regular breaks because it can be very exhausting. And a system that allows people to have respite care. So just being on the lookout for people who are caring, who might be isolated, who might be exhausted, and offering a helping hand.
Right, I think we're coming to the end of our formal meeting. You're going to not rush away, are you, Kathy? So please come and chat to Kathy afterwards. It's been immensely informative, and I think we get a sense of your wealth of your personal experience, which is great, and the way you've sort of set it out for us, I think it shows how important it is that this law is rejected by MPs. We should definitely pray about it and absolutely write to our MPs and make the case. So thank you, Kathy, very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening so well.